There is a particular kind of mistake that intelligent species make about other intelligent species, and it is always the same mistake, dressed in different cultural clothing across 1,000 different star systems. It is the mistake of reading kindness as incapacity, of looking at a creature that smiles and extends its hand and speaks in measured tones about cooperation and shared futures, and concluding, with the comfortable confidence of the untested, that the smile is the whole of what that creature is. The Galactic Conclave had made this mistake about humanity for long enough that it had stopped being a mistake and become a policy. It had been formalized, indexed, and filed under a heading that translated, across 17-member languages, as roughly, the Deathworlder exception, emotional volatility offset by social compliance. The document was 40 pages long. It had been authored by a committee of xenopsychologists who had spent a combined total of 11 months studying humanity at close range, which was, as one human diplomat later observed with lethal understatement, not quite enough time to understand what happened on the day the galaxy remembers simply as the reckoning, the day that every species, from the silicon-based collectives of the Outer Rim to the ancient hive minds of the Vareth cluster, would eventually build some form of cultural memory around. You first have to understand what humans have been doing for the previous century and a half. They had been nice. Extravagantly, almost incomprehensibly nice, by the standards of a galaxy that had spent its recorded history treating diplomacy as warfare conducted through paperwork. They had joined the conclave not as conquerors, though they had the capacity, but as applicants, presenting credentials, submitting to evaluations, accepting provisional membership with the patient humility of a species that understood the value of being underestimated. They had shared their medical technology without conditions when the Pelari plague swept through 4 systems. They had contributed engineering expertise to the conclave's infrastructure projects at rates far below market value because, as their representative explained to a council that found the reasoning baffling, people needed the bridges. They had, on 14 separate documented occasions, intervened militarily in conflicts they had no political stake in because civilians were dying and they were close enough to stop it. The galaxy had received all of this with the particular grace of those who have grown accustomed to generosity without fully registering its source. Humanity's contributions were catalogued, utilized, and quietly absorbed into the functioning of galactic civilization the way sunlight is absorbed by a plant, essential, taken for granted, its origin rarely considered. The Deathworlders, as humans were known in the informal registers of conclave species. A title born from the simple fact that Earth, by any objective xenobiological metric, should not have produced complex life at all, let alone a civilization, let alone one capable of surviving the 1,000 catastrophes that had tried to end it, were regarded with the fond, slightly uneasy respect one reserves for something powerful that has chosen, inexplicably, to be gentle. The unease was there. Every species felt it, in the way one feels a deep vibration before the sound arrives. But the gentleness was so consistent, so apparently genuine, so backed by a century and a half of documented behavior, that the unease had been mostly socialized away, filed under, not currently relevant, archived, forgotten, until the Keth sovereignty decided to test it. The Keth were not unintelligent. That is important to establish because the intelligence of the Keth is part of what made their decision so extraordinary in retrospect. The fact that a species capable of interstellar travel, of complex political organization, of sophisticated cultural production, looked at humanity and reached the conclusion they reached. The conclusion was this: the Deathworlders are powerful but unwilling. They possess weapons, but resist using them. They have leverage but decline to apply it. Therefore, they are, for all practical strategic purposes, the same as weak. The Keth sovereignty had been expanding its territorial claims along the outer corridor for 30 years, incrementally, carefully, absorbing smaller systems through a combination of economic pressure, political manipulation, and the occasional military demonstration directed at species too small to appeal effectively to the Conclave's protection. They had watched how the Conclave responded to these expansions, with concern, with statements, with committees, and they had watched how humanity responded, with diplomatic pressure, with aid to affected populations, with the tireless, patient machinery of legal and political advocacy. And they had decided that this pattern would hold. They were wrong in a way that would echo for 400 years. The specific incident that broke the pattern was not, on its surface, remarkable. A Keth military vessel, designated in their fleet registry as a patrol enforcer but equipped, as human intelligence had quietly noted for 2 years, with weapons systems inconsistent with any patrol function, entered the Alvari system without authorization and destroyed a human medical station. The station was unarmed. It was staffed by 63 people. It had been operating for 11 years, providing care to a population of roughly 2 million across 6 inhabited bodies in a system too poor and too remote to attract conclave infrastructure investment. The Keth vessel's commander filed a report describing the destruction as a navigational incident. The Keth Sovereignty's Foreign Ministry expressed regret. The Conclave's Resolution Council scheduled a hearing for the following quarter. And somewhere in the quiet architecture of human strategic command, something that had been holding for a century and a half made a sound like a hinge reaching the end of its tolerance, and then went very, very still. The thing about Deathworlders, the thing that xenopsychologists had circled for decades without ever quite landing on, was that their niceness and their lethality were not opposites. They were not a species that had chosen cooperation over conflict, softness over strength, the olive branch over the blade. They were a species that held all of it simultaneously, in the same hands, in the same chest, behind the same eyes that looked at you with warmth, and, if you were paying attention, with a depth of assessment that should have told you everything you needed to know. A human diplomat shaking your hand was also, automatically, cataloging your posture, your micro-expressions, the distance between your eyes and the exits, the weight distribution in your stance. Not out of paranoia. Out of a nervous system tuned by 4 million years of a planet that was trying to kill them to process thread data in the background of every social interaction, quietly, continuously, without effort, the way a heart beats. They were not nice despite being dangerous. They were nice because they had decided to be, which was an entirely different proposition, and one that carried an entirely different implication about what would happen if they decided otherwise. Commander Priya Okafor had been stationed at Conclave's Central Command for 6 years when the Alvari report crossed her desk. She was 38 years old, the daughter of a naval engineer and a trauma surgeon, raised between two traditions that shared a single philosophy: assess the damage honestly, then fix it. She had spent 6 years being the human face at conclave briefings. Calm, collaborative, generous with information and expertise, skilled at the particular diplomatic art of making other species feel safe in the presence of something that, on a purely biological level, their instincts categorized as apex predator. She was very good at her job. She read the Alvari report at 0600 hours on a Wednesday morning, and she read it 3 times, and then she set it down and looked out the viewport at the star field beyond and was quiet for 4 minutes. An unusually long stillness, even for her. Then she opened a secure channel to Earth's Strategic Command and said 9 words that were recorded in the session log and later declassified. "I need to know what we're allowed to do." The answer that came back was not the answer she had been given before. For 6 years, the answer had always been some variation of advocate, document, apply pressure, maintain relationships, trust the process. The answer that came back this time was different. It was a single word, and that word was anything. It had been authorized at the highest level of Earth's unified government, signed by all 7 regional councils, and it came with a secondary document that Okafor had never seen before in 6 years of service, a document that her clearance had not previously been sufficient to access, which told her something significant about how seriously this was being taken. The document was titled the Reckoning Protocol, and it had been authored not in response to the Elvari incident, but 23 years earlier, maintained and updated by a quiet department within Earth's strategic command that had no official public existence, and whose entire purpose was to be ready for the day the decision was made to stop absorbing damage and start delivering consequences. 23 years. The Deathworlders had been preparing their response to this moment for 23 years before the moment arrived, which meant that the Keth sovereignty had not triggered an improvised reaction. They had triggered a plan. Okafor spent the next 18 hours in a series of meetings that she would later describe, in her memoirs, as the strangest professional experience of her life, not because of what was decided, but because of the atmosphere in which it was decided. There was no rage in those rooms. No elevated voices. No table striking. None of the emotional theatrics that other conclave species often associated with human decision-making under stress. There was instead a quality she struggled to name precisely, but eventually settled on as resolution. The specific emotional state of a person who has been patient for a very long time, who has used that patience well, who has built something with it, and who has now arrived at the moment when the thing they built will be used for the purpose it was designed for. The people in those rooms were not angry. They were ready. And readiness, Okafor wrote, is so much more frightening than anger, because anger is temporary and readiness is a door that, once opened, does not close again on its own. The conclave received humanity's formal notification at 1400 hours, Galactic Standard Time, on a Thursday. It was not a declaration of war. Humanity was meticulous about this, then and in all subsequent communications, because the legal and moral architecture of what they were doing mattered enormously to them, not as a performance for the conclave's benefit, but as a genuine expression of who they were and what distinguished their use of force from the Keth's use of force. The notification was titled a Declaration of Direct Remediation and Accountability, and it was the most thoroughly documented diplomatic instrument the conclave's legal division had ever received. It cited 147 years of conclave membership in good standing. It cited humanity's contributions, indexed, quantified, cross-referenced, to conclave infrastructure, medicine, conflict resolution, and emergency response. It cited the Elvari incident with forensic precision, the navigational incident claimed demolished in 4 paragraphs of technical analysis that left no logical room for alternative interpretation. And then it stated, with a clarity that the conclave's translation matrices rendered in every member language simultaneously without lag or ambiguity, that humanity was exercising its right under Article 17 of the Conclave Charter. A right that had existed in the Charter since its founding but had never been invoked, to pursue direct remediation against a member species for documented, willful harm to human personnel and infrastructure, outside the Standard Committee process, on the grounds that the Standard Committee process had been given 147 years to prove its adequacy and had, in the specific matter of protecting human interests, consistently failed to do so. Article 17 had been written into the Charter as a theoretical safeguard. Its authors, none of whom were human, since humanity had not yet joined the conclave at the time of its drafting, had intended it as a pressure valve, a legal acknowledgement that the committee process had limits, a clause that would never be invoked because no species would ever be willing to accept the political cost of invoking it. They had not anticipated a species that had spent a century and a half building political capital specifically so that it would have enough to spend when the moment required it. Humanity had, over 147 years, done the math. They knew exactly what invoking Article 17 would cost them in conclave relationships, trade agreements, and political positioning. They had factored that cost into their planning decades ago. They had built enough surplus goodwill, enough documented contribution, enough carefully maintained alliances that they could absorb the cost and remain standing. The Deathworlders had not simply decided to stop being nice. They had planned for the decision years in advance, and they had made sure that when they stopped, they could afford to. The Keth sovereignty received a separate communication 40 minutes later, delivered not through diplomatic channels, but broadcast on all military frequencies simultaneously. It was short. It contained the coordinates of every Keth military installation within 4 systems of the Alvari incident. It contained the names of the 63 people who had been killed on the medical station. All 63, individually named, with their years of service and the populations they had cared for noted beside each name. And it contained a single sentence at the end that the Keth Foreign Ministry's translation team rendered 7 different ways before settling on the version that best captured its specific register of absolute, unhurried certainty. We are coming to collect what is owed, and we have already decided how this ends. The Keth Sovereignty's Supreme Commander convened an emergency military council. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, 3 of the council's 7 members had formally requested that the sovereignty open immediate unconditional negotiations with humanity. The commander overruled them. He would not make that mistake twice, because there would not be a second opportunity to make it. What the galaxy witnessed over the next 31 days was not a war in the sense that any conclave species had previously defined the term. Wars, in the galactic record, followed recognizable patterns: escalation, attrition, negotiation, settlement. They were ugly and costly, and their outcomes were usually ambiguous, the geopolitical landscape after them resembling less a resolved situation than a temporarily stabilized one, with the original tensions buried shallowly beneath whatever treaty had been exhausted into existence. What humanity conducted against the Keth sovereignty followed none of these patterns, because it had not been designed as a war. It had been designed as a demonstration. Precise, bounded, and intended to communicate a single message with absolute clarity to the Keth, to the Conclave, and to every species watching from the carefully maintained distance of their diplomatic missions. The message was not, "We are powerful." Every species already knew humans were powerful. The message was, "We know exactly how powerful we are, and we know exactly how much of that power this situation requires, and we have used precisely that amount and not 1 unit more." The precision was the message. The restraint within the overwhelming force was the message. The fact that it was over in 31 days, with the Keth's military infrastructure neutralized, their expansion reversed, a remediation framework imposed, and their civilian population entirely unharmed, that was the message. Commander Okafor commanded the lead engagement vessel, ESNS Reckoning Day, named not by the Admiralty but by its crew, who had submitted the name through the standard registry process with a quiet unanimity that the Admiralty had chosen not to override. She had expected, in the weeks of preparation, to feel something she recognized from the literature of human conflict. The cold clarity of combat, the tunnel vision of crisis, the dissociation that her instructors had described as the mind's way of managing the unmanageable. She felt none of those things. What she felt, from the moment the fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of Keth space to the moment the Sovereignty's military commander transmitted his unconditional acceptance of the remediation framework on the 31st day, was a quality she had no precise word for. It was closest, she thought, to the feeling described by the trauma surgeons she had grown up watching her mother be, the focused, grounded, almost meditative state of someone who has trained for years for exactly this, who is doing exactly what they are capable of, and who has stripped away every consideration except the task and the standard they intend to meet. It was not triumphant. It was not joyful. It was the feeling, she wrote later, of an instrument being used for its intended purpose, a feeling that was neither good nor bad in itself, but that carried within it the full weight of everything that had made the instrument necessary. The conclave watched. Every diplomatic mission within range had observation assets deployed. The Pelari, whose plague humanity had treated without condition 60 years earlier, sent a private message to Okafor's vessel on the 22nd day that contained no strategic or political content, only a phrase in their native language that translated as something like, "We see you, and we understand now." The Alvari system's surviving population, informed of the operation through a communications relay established by human engineers on the first day of the engagement, sent a transmission that took 3 days to reach Okafor's vessel and consisted entirely of names. The names of patients the medical station staff had treated over 11 years, read aloud by community leaders in the native languages of 6 inhabited worlds, 214,000 names in total, the recording running to 19 hours and 42 minutes. Okafor played it on the ship's public address system on the 28th day. No one spoke during it. No one was asked to. The stories began almost immediately. This is what the galaxy does with things it cannot categorize. It narrativizes them, builds them into forms that can be passed down, examines them from new angles across generations until the meaning settles into something that can be carried. The Pelari called it the Day of the Reckoning Sun. The Alvari called it the Naming, because what they remembered most was not the fleet or the 31 days, but the fact that 63 dead were never once allowed to become a statistic, that every human communication throughout the entire operation included the names, as if the people who had died were present in every decision made in their absence. The Keth, in the private oral traditions that would emerge a generation after the event when their culture had processed enough of what had happened to begin speaking about it honestly, called it the mirror, because what had shattered them was not the force applied against them, but the reflection it showed, the sudden and undeniable image of what they had done seen clearly for the first time, held up by a species that refused to let it be minimized. The conclave's formal record was more clinical, as formal records tend to be. But even the clinical language could not fully contain what had shifted. The committee system was reformed within 2 years, not because humanity demanded it, they did not, but because enough member species had watched 31 days of precise, principled, documented remediation and arrived independently at the conclusion that the old system's failure had not been a failure of intention, but of accountability. Species do not reform their institutions out of fear, generally. They reform them when they have been shown, concretely and undeniably, that the existing structure has a cost that someone is paying. Humanity's willingness to pay that cost in the open, to document every step, to name every name, to conduct its reckoning with the same moral seriousness it had brought to its century and a half of cooperation, that was what moved the conclave. Not the ships, not the tactical precision. The refusal, even in righteous force, to stop being the thing they had always been. Commander Okafor retired from active service 4 years after the reckoning. She spent the following decades teaching at Earth's Interstellar Academy, where her course on the ethics of force became required study not only for human cadets, but, eventually, for military officers from 11 conclave species whose governments had requested the curriculum. She taught it the same way every year, beginning not with doctrine or strategy but with a question she put to every incoming class on the first day, written on the board before anyone arrived, simple and enormous. What is the difference between being unable to harm and choosing not to? the answers varied. They were always interesting. She never gave her own answer in class, because she believed the question was more valuable than any answer she could provide. But in her memoirs, published in the last year of her life, she wrote it down once, for the record. "The difference," she wrote, "is everything. It is the entire distance between a prey animal and a person. And the galaxy learned that distance in 31 days, because we decided it was time they knew." She paused in the writing there, her notes show, and then added a final line that her editor wanted to remove and that she insisted on keeping. "We were nice for 150 years. We are still nice. We will always choose to be nice. But now they know what the choosing means. And that knowledge, I think, is the kindest thing we have ever given them." Every species still tells the story. They tell it differently, through different cultural lenses, with different details emphasized, from different positions in the moral geometry of what occurred. But they all tell it, because every species that was present in the galaxy that year understood, at some level that transcended political analysis and strategic calculation, that something fundamental had been demonstrated. Not about human power, that was already known. About human character. About what it meant to be a species that had come from a world that tried to kill it every day for 4 million years, that had survived by being harder than the world expected and kinder than the world required, that had carried both of those things across the stars and into the complicated, imperfect, astonishing project of galactic civilization. They had been nice. They had meant it. They had also, quietly, in the spaces between their generosity and their patience, never forgotten what they were. And on the day they finally stopped being nice, for 31 days, precisely, and then never again, the galaxy finally understood that the niceness had always been the more impressive thing, because it had always been a choice, share,